can continue on and listen to Julie's presentation. We'll record it, and we just obviously won't make any action.
Yeah, happy to take roll. And actually, we do have a quorum because the committee
is
so small.
Okay, we need to recruit.
Yeah.
Next meeting.
Mm-hmm. So I'll go down the list. Vaughn Jones or Kirk Will.
Yeah, Kirk's here.
Hi, Kirk. Amy Moyer.
Here.
Good morning, Amy. John Ring is excused. Commissioner Jody Shattuck McNally is not here. And Brett Wolk.
Hello.
Morning, Brett. So amazingly, 3 does make up quorum.
Okay.
Yeah, and I agree. Recruitment sounds great.
More recruitment. I can work with you, Courtney, on that. So I think this group knows I'm just going to jump in as an acting chair of this committee. Katie had her beautiful baby boy at the end of July, so I will be just jumping in through the end of the year to keep these committee discussions going. And Courtney, I don't believe we have any meeting minutes to take action on. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Well, moving on the agenda, I will give just a quick update on the Forest Resilience Planning Guide one-pager. So that has been a real flagship item for this committee. We have been working on just a one-pager to act as more of a flyer and an announcement. I will put the link in the chat as to where the content is for that one-pager. We did get it back over to Lynn last week for some final formatting. So her team, Lynn Elliott and her team have volunteered to do some of the formatting. So this is a usable document. But if folks are curious where we ended up with content and see any last flags, just please send them to me. And this should be inclusive of the discussion that this committee had last month to make a few adjustments to this. So I will send around a final formatted copy when I get it, so that we can just work over email if anyone has tweaks, and hopefully have a final copy ready to go by our next meeting as a group. Any questions on just the quick update on where the one-pager is? Okay,
That's
well,
great.
yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Brett, for all of your work. I'm going to turn it over here pretty quickly to Julie Shapiro with the Keystone Policy Institute. Thank you so much for being here. She's going to talk to us about the Wildfire and Watershed Initiative for Resilient Colorado. Really looking forward to hearing more about that effort and your presentation. And just to set the stage, this committee has opted to have a series of presentations starting earlier this year and throughout the end of the year, to really think about, in an era of uncertain funding across the state and federal levels, how can we continue to make recommendations on best practices and ideas to leverage resources. And so we've talked about some of the key existing pain points that have come out of some of the discussions with the Forest Resilience Planning Guide, and some of our own knowledge as a committee, and some of what we've heard from our communities, but honing in on 4 that have risen to the top of. The first being capacity. That capacity is endemic across many different sectors, but that communities and organizations often lack the capacity to compile plans or prioritize landscapes, translate data into meaningful action, be a project manager for projects, get through the permitting. There aren't always a lot of resources in the funding space that lend itself to those capacity pinch points. Match is another one that we've identified, of especially for small and rural communities, it can be really difficult to come up with secured match. Oftentimes there's a chicken and egg situation of, you need that first domino to fall to be able to have enough match to be competitive in larger scale funding. So we've been thinking about some programs that address those issues. Timelines from a funding perspective is one that we've honed in on, of oftentimes, many funding programs don't sync up. or, you apply for one, you wait 6 months, you hear yes or no. Even if it is yes, you have to contract for another 6 months. And it's really hard to keep those projects and the momentum. And how do you sequence and secure all of the funding when the timelines either lag or don't quite match up? And then I think specific to the Forest Resilience Planning Guide, there's not often a lot of funding for the earlier stages of readiness that we've identified are pretty critical to keep communities going or even get them started. And so thinking about what funding opportunities might exist for those first couple stages of establishing the shared vision and community partners, or translating that vision into more of an actionable plan. So just some background for you, Julie. I know I sent that just quickly over the weekend, but a good reminder for the committee, just as we stay purposeful, think about these presentations from that lens, because ideally at the end of the year, we'll be compiling some of the recommendations or things that we've heard in the presentations potentially into recommendations that we might bring to the full Forest Health Council and then beyond, whether those might be legislative recommendations or just recommendations to agencies on some of our own expertise and what we might glean from these discussions. So with that, Julie, I'd love to turn it over to you. And, I assume please feel free to stop Julie if you have questions during her presentation, and then we have plenty of time today to ask questions at the end and have any discussion as a committee. Go ahead, Brett.
Just real quick, I wanted to acknowledge John Sanderson is here, joined. I don't know if you saw that. We kind of joined a minute or two late, but I don't know if you just quick introduce yourself of why you're here. I don't know if people know your connection or why you're here.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Go ahead, John.
Hello, all. I think I've met all of you at some point or another. John Sanderson. I'm Katie's boss, and I'm filling in for her in a number of spaces. I'm not officially filling in here. Amy's filling in here, but I'm stepping into a few spaces that Katie typically works in while she's taking care of little Owen, and also something that I know some of you know, but worth sharing with all of you is that we have the Colorado Forest Collaborative Summit coming up on September 17th and 18th. I'm sure some of you, maybe all of you, will be there. The summit, to the extent possible, we're trying to structure the content of the summit in a way where it complements the watershed and wildfire initiative. And so that we're taking information from the initiative and sharing that information to the extent to which there's been any clarity that has emerged. We want to share that with summit participants, and we also are hoping that the summit can be an opportunity for the smaller, maybe more rural organizations that aren't typically represented in these statewide discussions to have an opportunity to share their perspectives with leadership as well. So part of what I'm doing here is just kind of paying attention to those places that we can potentially make those connections. I've talked with Julie already at some length about that, but open to other ideas that you all have as well about how we might be able to make that connection better.
Well, thank you, John. We really appreciate spending the time to join us. And yeah, definitely feel free to think about how this committee can support your work in the summit, and certainly if there are individual members on this committee that you can draw upon. So we appreciate your involvement.
And there are several people I'm already drawing upon: Allison, Brett, Julie, Courtney. So thank you. I mean, it'd be great if you could join us at the summit as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for the reminder. We're a small but all-star team here on the Legislative Resources Committee.
Yes,
so
wonderful.
Well, great. Well, I think that's also a great setup for you, Julie. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Hey, everybody. Julie Shapiro. I lead the natural resources work at Keystone Policy Center. We're a nonprofit, non-advocacy organization been around about 50 years. Our mission is around bringing people together to solve tough challenges and reach higher common ground. So my work is focused mainly on lands, water, wildlife, wildfire issues. And I am helping to lead the facilitation for the Wildfire and Watershed Initiative for Resilient Colorado, which we call WORK. Ben Guillaume with Conservation Investment Management has also been a key partner in this, and he may be joining a little bit. We were actually both just on a call together, John, talking about that afternoon session at the Collaborative Summit with someone else who was organizing that. So making lots of connections here. So I do have some slides. I know some of you are familiar with this effort, but hopefully this will get everyone on the same page. And also the slides will end with, where we started with Amy's points on the pain points and kind of reflecting on what we've been talking about and hearing about through this initiative. And then hopefully that can generate some good discussion. Thanks so much for having us. It's just great to connect the dots, which is part of what I just see my role in this work effort being, is just helping folks see the work of others and find opportunities for alignment and coordination. So I'm going to start my share. Just some basic slides. You can feel free to grab my email address there if you need it for later. And so I'll start with just an overview, a little bit of the history and purpose of work, and then the strategies that we've been talking about and how we kind of got to that point. I'll briefly tell you about how work is becoming organized. I say becoming because it's really been a pretty rapid evolution. And I'll say right up front, invitation to anyone to become involved in that conversation. And then connections and reflections, as I said, with the pain points conversation. So work, purpose, mission. I'll start just actually with a note on its history. It really started last summer and fall. I think I started getting more involved in the fall. When a number of folks, water utilities, some state and federal agencies, some nonprofits, were really asking the question of how do we get the private sector more engaged in thinking about wildfire and thinking about themselves as beneficiaries, whether direct or indirect, of any kind of wildfire and watershed resilient mitigation work that happens. And that's where it started. And I got connected actually because I was working on some other efforts statewide around conservation, recreation, and climate resilience, and was wanting to connect the dots on those as well. And Denver Water hosted a conversation among private sector leaders in December, just to get the conversation going. It was just a lunchtime meeting. And then coming out of that was when those who had been planning around this conversation and starting to catalyze these conversations got together to say, what are we trying to do here? What strategies could be pursued? How, and at the same time, of course, the federal context was changing in terms of funding and capacity. And so there was this moment to say, how do we think about the role of non-federal partners along with federal partners in just solving for the challenges we have, particularly around funding for wildfire and watershed resilience. So that's really the work I've been doing really since the spring, around trying to better frame up the key issues and opportunities and talk to a lot of folks and put together some strategies. And that's how it's evolved into this effort. But it's really, I'd say, emergent and nascent. And we've gone from having like 20 people interested overnight to like 100 people on my list in the past, month or so. And so just to know, it's really, it's really been evolving rapidly, and it's a great opportunity to plug in. So everything I'm sharing with you actually is the first time I've really put this together in a presentation, because it's just really evolved over this past month. So the purpose is to advance statewide sustainable public and private funding and other strategies to enhance the pace and scale of wildfire risk reduction and watershed resilience. As I've started to put things all in one place, and I thought about, well, that's the mission of work. What's the vision? I've really leaned into the Forest Health Council's work on visioning, because I think there's no need to create a new vision. Really, work is taking on particularly that sustainable funding piece to try to contribute to that broader vision that you all have worked on. So I won't read that back to you because you've all seen that. This is all stuff you all probably know, but just overall, is the frame for this has been, we have a lot of forests in need of treatment. The price tag's really high. We know that if we don't invest in forest health and wildfire mitigation and watershed resilience strategies, it has a huge economic impact, and that prevention can be much more cost effective than just reaction to wildfire. And we've framed this really around diverse assets and geographies are at risk. Of course, life and property, which we center a lot in these conversations with good reason, and also water and energy supply and infrastructure, various economies and industries, recreation, transportation, watersheds. So work really looks broadly at all those different ways in which fire affects a lot of different private and public sector partners. We know there's lots of work happening out there. And so one of the things we've put some attention to is what is our foundational focus with this initiative. We're not trying to do everything, but sustainable funding has been a key frame of just how do we get the dollars to do the work. Then watershed resilience and natural environments has been more the frame, knowing there's so much work in the built environment. And I know some folks say, community protection versus, forests and watersheds. We have really framed it around doing work on watershed resilience and natural environments benefits communities and helps to protect communities. And we know there's work happening around home hardening and, insurance issues for built environments and a variety of other topics kind of in those built environments. So we're kind of focusing on the work that has to be done in watersheds and forests to help support communities. We're focused on risk reduction rather than wildfire response. We're really trying to elevate the conversation or, emphasize the need for conversations around landscape priorities. It's both private and public lands. We're trying to take the statewide view, knowing that there's a lot of work happening locally. And we've got non-federal, public and private partners and federal partners at the table. One question I asked early and often with Allison, for example, is, how is this different from Forest Health Council? Because we know you're all doing work and that touches on a lot of these things. And I think a key thing is that, just in different ways, we have strengths of this group really arose from a lot of private sector partners, talking to public partners and saying, like, how do we come together in a self-driven initiative? It's not hosted by the state. It is not, formed through legislation. And I think that offers different kinds of opportunities about the strategies that the group is talking about and different members of work can pursue. And so they're kind of complementary. And we hope through this conversation and conversations with the legislative committee and others, we can think about how do these complement each other and how can we lean into what different groups can do and have different power to influence. So it's just something to think about as well. But hopefully the priorities align pretty strongly, and it's just a matter of which players can do what things. So again, sustainable funding seen as a key barrier and opportunity. One thing Keystone did, and Ben, who I mentioned earlier, this spring into the summer was a lot of interviews. We talked to, I think, 50 or 60 people across almost as many organizations, just to really ask, particularly from the view of sustainable funding, what needs to be done, what are the solutions, but also what are the other issues that even if you had funding for, still need to be solved for, right? Like that, that funding can't solve for on its own. And so just some notes on, what we heard. We did produce a scoping report that just summarizes key themes in about 10 pages that, we know there's been a lot of great funding opportunities in recent years, and also there's been changes, including in federal funding, and there's still uncertainties there. We know there's been great state-funded programs, and those are well regarded, but funding doesn't meet demand and doesn't meet that scale of need that we talked about in an earlier slide. We know that private sector funding and financing alone can't solve the gap. I mean, that's one thing I think that became clear last fall when we started to ask, how can the private sector get involved? No one's going to write $1 billion check, but there's still really important ways that private sector partnerships and funding can be a catalyst and leverage. And I think including in addressing some of those pain points that Amy was mentioning. We heard a lot about just who's getting the attention, like what's the right scale, which geographies are, being prioritized currently by funding, but also what are some of the other considerations that, again, may not be life and property as directly, but may have to do with water and energy and utilities and infrastructure and other needs in other places in the state. And there's no silver bullet. That's, probably obvious, but that's something we talked a lot about, or how do different strategies come together, and how do we focus on prevention to the extent possible, knowing that wildfire is still just part of the landscape, and it's something we're all learning to live with. So we heard about what's needed for funding, workforce, forest treatment costs for equipment, WUI home hardening, again, less of a focus for us, but that came up a lot. Capacity and planning, again, to the earlier points Amy made, innovation and technology investments, outreach, and, building social license. And then that said, even if you have all the funding to do all those things, you need the policy, the coordination, innovation, the permitting in place to actually get work done. And so we're really thinking about what do we do from a private-public collaboration perspective. So there's 2 buckets of strategies I'll just cruise through, and then that will bring us quickly to a couple notes on organization and then more discussion. Statewide public funding, local public funding, private public funding, and forest restoration economy are all strategies that the group has really started to hone in on. And these are the 4 big buckets we're thinking about. Just building those out a little bit, creating a statewide non-Tabor restricted public funding measure or revenue source is something that's been discussed. There's precedence for that with water plan funding. There's a lot of conversation happening about broadly the conservation, recreation, and climate resilient funding needs of the state. So those are things that we are exploring. Local public funding, knowing that, there's been success in some communities around various local funding measures. There's a lot of interest, in creative things like forest improvement districts, and also just how you work with counties and municipalities to look at their readiness and ability to pursue some of this work. And so we're working with partners to try to start to understand strategically from a statewide perspective where different communities are at, where there might be opportunities, and what the private and public sector can do together in terms of pursuing some of those opportunities and supporting, at least exploring them. Private public funding models. So thinking about everything from pooled funds, like the Restore model, to the way community foundations at a more local level think about private public funding, thinking about financing opportunities, revolving loan, like how do all these things potentially come together in ways that can help address gaps. And again, I think the pain points, that you highlighted, Amy, that's one of the questions too, is how can private public funding and private sector funding perhaps address some of those pain points? Can't solve the billion-dollar question, but maybe can think about some of those gaps. And then forest restoration economy is a framing around thinking broadly around workforce, business, innovation, even housing, like how do these pieces come together such that we can think about the stewardship piece of forests and watershed resilience, but also the opportunities for economic benefits to communities. And that's, that could be everything from the really innovative stuff about wood products use to maybe the less new, but still very needed things that are needed to actually make all of this come together. So those are 4 things that we're all talking about. And again, these were really solidified only a few weeks ago. So that's where now we're diving in, right? Those are the next steps of how do we push on these further to think about different activities and actions to make some of this real. We also have supporting strategies. We're thinking about how do we support policy engagement, whether it's the Forest Health Council and your ability to make policy recommendations at the state level, how can we liaise to say these are priorities that are coming from this work group? And also there's interest from the federal level. I will say we know that different people in work have different ability to advocate or prohibitions on lobbying. So, we're trying to use this as an incubation space, which is part of why it's nice that it's kind of privately incubated and funded, so that we can use that and then people can plug in their appropriate ways. But for sure, just trying to track those policy needs and opportunities. There's some interest in metrics, right? And like, how do we think about return on investment and not just acres treated, but what do you get in terms of risk reduction? And we know folks are doing work on that, but can we create more of a common language about how we're talking about these benefits? We're thinking about landscape scale implementation. Work itself is not an implementer, but plenty of the participants in it are. And, we're looking to examples like the Salt River Project in Arizona or other places where they really kind of holistically brought together good neighbor authority agreements and private and public funding and other, mechanisms to say, here's a really big landscape vision of how we can get a lot of work done. And so we're still trying to think about how work can help support and encourage that kind of work. And then strategic communications, thinking about where the right leverage points, especially with the private sector, in terms of gaining champions and getting people more engaged in and supportive of this work and kind of supporting it in whatever ways they can. So I kind of ran through that, those details already. So those are things we're just digging in on more. And how we're doing this, again, we know there's a lot of collaboration happening at local and statewide levels and even among national networks. I don't expect you to look at this network model in detail. It's not perfect anyway, but we did try to think about who's doing what already. And again, that kind of was what brought us back to let's keep our focus on the sustainable funding frame, because there are so many folks who are working in different frames around whether it's working with local collaboratives or working on post-fire or working on policy issues. And so there's obviously a nexus to all those things with the sustainable funding piece, but we're trying to actively think about that network map. And we're really thinking about work as a collective impact model. So the foundational kind of principle of collective impact is that large scale change requires broad cross-sector coordination, and no single entity can solve something on its own. And that's true for wildfire. So we're trying to add value by catalyzing the coordination on these conversations and strategies I just highlighted. We're not trying to supersede any individual organization's own efforts and authorities, but really, again, help folks see each other, understand what work is happening, understand where there might be more opportunities for coordination, alignment, strategy, or just need for lessons learned on some of these funding issues. There's a lot of examples I won't go into where this is already happening, where we've just been able to say, did you know this conversation is happening on statewide funding? And really, we should connect these so that we're not competing or not just, just not even aware of each other. So, so that's part of what we're trying to do. Collective impact models are based on 5 core conditions: having a common purpose, finding ways to have shared measurement to know if you're reaching goals, having lots of different actors, having mutually reinforcing activities, having continuous communication, and providing backbone support to make that happen. So for sake of time, I won't build that up too much because I've touched on that, I think, in different ways of how work is trying to do that. Keystone is working as a backbone organization in this case of just trying to make that coordination happen, but really the power comes from all the folks in the group working towards this broader purpose around sustainable funding and advancing private and public sector funding. And then briefly on the organization of this, which is really new, just because, again, we went from this kind of ad hoc conversation and question of how do we get folks involved to, wow, there's a lot of interest in how we organize this. So we're developing a charter. I don't want to be too bureaucratic, but we are kind of thinking about how do we provide an umbrella for lots of folks to plug in and have a network on this topic. An action team that's really been serving as a steering committee. We have had a leadership roundtable meet, which is really the CEO level. And the purpose there is to get executives to say, we support this, we're committing our staff to this, these are the right strategies. I think we're going to move towards having a nimble kind of just executive committee to bounce things off of when really needed. And then I think where the real emphasis is going to be starting this month is these working groups and strategy stewards or leads. So digging in on those things that I highlighted and just how to move them forward. So that's a bit about work. And this is my last real substantive slide. So I was reflecting on what Amy sent me ahead of time about the pain points and that. So this first set of bullets are what she already described. And I think for sure we heard about those in all of our scoping and we're hearing about them. in the discussions we're having now. I will also say, like, having worked on other topics for conservation and recreation planning or land conservation and talking to lots of land trusts and things like that, these are all really common pain points for folks, especially those working at a more local level. This idea of capacity, folks having one or two, staff members that are trying to do everything, finding the match, bridging the gaps of timing of agreements, and like having the support for capacity and planning. So some of the solutions that have been coming up in our conversations for that I think are relevant most to the pain points you've identified are around how do you support local collaboratives and networks with capacity building, with grant navigation and grant writing. Maybe it doesn't have to be that everyone has to have their own, capacity to do that. Also with technical assistance for planning, we know there's groups like CFRI that are, being able to go in and like kind of do the strike work of helping with the technical pieces. So thinking about those models, and again, that's where I think a statewide vision is helpful to think about how can you set up systems that provide some efficiencies there. Certainly, we've heard about using the readiness framework and resilience planning guide to match funding to local capacity and stages of readiness. Could aggregated funding and matching funds, help streamline some of the challenges with administering grants? That's a question that's come up a lot with Colorado's outdoor strategy too. Can we think more explicitly about planning and capacity funds versus treatment funds? Again, from a different how to wear Colorado's outdoor strategy and the funding mechanisms for that have really been explicit about that. Like, are you applying for a planning grant or an early wins, pilot project grant or something like broader scale? Can some of those models perhaps apply in the way we think about wildfire too? And can the private sector get involved, especially in some of those pain points around match or timelines, by either just giving grants that help seed an effort, or doing financing work like revolving loans or things just so that we have bridge funding. Again, there's a lot of those examples in the conservation world already. So those are all things that we're thinking about. And Ben's not on today, but he also works for the Colorado Forum, and I know they're talking about those questions too, about how could groups like that and private sector help with the planning phases, and help folks get over that hump. I will say that even like private sector seed funding is what allowed work to get started. Just people saying we're willing to help you get going. And then we hear a lot about creative match funds, and others are better versed to talk about this, but really thinking about what is the alignment and connection of different opportunities that are out there and how can they be paired against each other? So one example that's come up a lot is, for example, the wildfire ready action planning. There's through CWCB and then some of their grants for actual work for river restoration. They allow that to get matched against other things that are happening in forest health. And can we think about those connections to address some of those earlier stages of readiness and also the match needs of different projects? So that's all specific. That's not the only universe of solutions that work is focusing on, but I wanted to highlight that just in terms of the pain points Amy was able to share with me. Thank you for doing that ahead of time. And of course we've talked about all these broader things too. I think, work would a lot of members would also say, like, yes, all these early stages and local capacity things are really important. And no matter what, when you add it up, we don't have the dollars to do the treatments. Like, proportionally, there's probably more money to do treatments, than planning. But how do we also just, raise the bar overall for sustainable funding? So that's just a little, zooming back out to the context of how work is thinking about all of these things. So I would love to keep talking about all of this and hear your thoughts and questions. I do want to mention our next work session is August 25th, which is next Monday in Berthoud. It's all day, and we're going to take those 4 main strategies: statewide public, local public, private sector, and forest restoration economy, and really deep dive on those in particular. But if there's anything that comes out of this meeting or the legislative committee one on Friday that we can bring into those conversations, we'd be happy to, and we'd love to keep the conversation going. And really, work is just a big tent. And so if anyone, I know it's short notice, but if anyone's like, oh, I want to come on Monday, please let me know. Or if you aren't able to, but you want to be on that list so you're aware of future work and how it's shaping up. It may feel more baked than it is, but it's all very new. So we'd love to think about how folks might plug in. And if you just want to plug into one work stream or one strategy, that's great too. So that is my presentation, and I'm going to stop my share. Hopefully that was helpful in what you were looking for. Sorry, I'm on Google Meet, so I always forget. I often like hit the leave button instead of the stop presenting button on Google, and I didn't do it this time, so that's good.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was super informative to me. I feel like I have heard of this group in a variety of different contexts, so it was really helpful to hear your summary. And I think there's a ton of overlap, I think, with the discussions of this committee and the Forest Health Council in general. So one of the questions that maybe we'll leave time for before we wrap up is just a little bit of what you mentioned of how can this committee help advance some of the conversations that work is happening, and vice versa. You know, how could we develop a little bit of a reciprocal relationship? Because as you were speaking, I had some of the same thoughts of, you know, is there power in sort of joint recommendations of, you know, there's a role that this committee and the Forest Health Council plays. There's a unique role that this, you know, coalition is playing as well. Are there areas that, you know, joint recommendations or joint efforts could be really powerful? So, you know, would love your thoughts on that, but maybe we just save some space to have some discussion and make sure we loop back at the end before you take off. And then especially as you present, I think, to the other Forest Health Committee later this week, you know, we can kind of join forces and create a plan. I have some questions, but I want to open it up to the rest of the committee before I jump in.
I say start it off, Amy. I got a couple questions, but yeah.
I have, yeah.
I guess this is all I've kind of heard about it, but that was really great presentation. It's a little more new to me of sort of how it's ramping up and coming together.
Yeah.
I had a quick conversation just about the root of this initiative with the interest of the private sector. And I'm really curious if you can share a little bit more of kind of who's at the table from the private sector and kind of what their, you know, what their take on risk is in terms of their funding models. Because at times, you know, foundations in the private sector can take on potentially more risk than some of the public sector entities in funding earlier stages or funding more innovative models. So those were kind of a two-part question of if you could share a little bit more about the private sector and sort of where either their level of involvement is trending, and if there's some interest in maybe taking on greater levels of risk that public funding often can't do.
Yeah, those are great questions. And I'll just say, I'm not going to speak for any participants on this, obviously. So I'm just going to give Julie's view of like what we've heard. So again, some of this predates even my involvement, but really the conversation started with folks like the utilities, and here's Ben, I'm so glad he's here. Utilities and National Wild Turkey Federation, and also Forest Service and others just saying, you know, everybody bears risk from wildfire, right? Like it impacts you as a water utility very clearly, you know, if in terms of water supply, but also, you know, if you are a recreation, you know, outfitter, or you just have a hospital that is impacted by wildfire, or you have workforce that's traveling on roads that get closed. So there was a sense of everyone's impacted, but not that many folks really center it as something that they focus on or invest in. And so the question was, how do you get more folks kind of just really interested in that? And so we had, you know, some NGOs, some state and federal agencies, some utilities in particular, Ben and the Colorado Forum, kind of coming together to the table to say, let's just get people more interested as a starting place and see like how they see themselves. So that was kind of some of the foundational work. And I think that covers broadly, you know, I can name more specific organizations, like State Forest Service, DNR, et cetera, have been at the table. Northern and Denver Water, TNC and Trust for Public Land have come to the table more recently, but like some of the NGOs, and then again, the Colorado Forum, which represents a lot of different business interests and beyond. I think one thing we heard pretty early on, and it was clear, was like the private sector can't solve this. And especially for a lot of private sector industries, if there's this particular ask, and particularly in their communities, you know, if they're more locally based, and that's where like they can say, great, what's the need and how does this affect me? But at first, Amy, when you asked about how people think about risk, I thought you meant like risk to their businesses from wildfire. And I think, you know, what's clear is like for most folks, they can see that it's connected, but it's not part of like their ROI analysis, right? In terms of, you know, investment. And so it's still a philanthropic thing for a lot of private sector folks. Whereas for like, say, water utilities or even energy as a business model, because, you know, they see that more directly. In terms of the risk folks are willing to take on, I'd love for Ben to talk about that more, but I think there's two categories when you talk about, you know, when people think about private sector dollars. There's the financing piece, which expects a return on investment and it's not free money, right? It's coming back to folks, you know, in some form because you're financing or doing loans or, you know, other ways of, you know, thinking about bridge funding, just as some examples, and Ben has a lot of experience there. But then in terms of willingness to take on like risk from more of a philanthropic or grant-based opportunity, again, I think that comes back to what are the missions or the interests, and can you connect that work, you know, the work that you're asking for support on, either to your geographic interest, your community, you know, some way connected to like your climate resilience goals. You know, in some cases, some folks are interested in carbon credits. You know, there's just a whole range, and so the rationale that then drives people's willingness to invest in something is going to be probably variable. But I will say that everyone's, I think, since January, thought more about what is our role here. You know, because folks have recognized that the funding and capacity at the federal level is changing, and we don't know exactly where it lands, for better or for worse. But just folks have started to ask, like, what's our role in this? And so I think folks are willing to come to the table and think about, can we be part of the solution and perhaps take some risks in this? The last thing I'll say is like prioritization, right? Informed by the data and the science and the models, I think are important. Folks want to know, where do you invest, you know, your funding to get good results, and for what purposes and benefits. So that's another way that's important to talk about it. So it's not just like random acts of mitigation, right? Ben, welcome. I gave the overview of the strategies and work and its history, and, you know, but you came in a perfect time because now we're just having a discussion. And, you know, Amy's question right when you were coming in was about, you know, how the private sector thinks about the risk of investing in this work, or why they would invest in this work. So you heard my response. Do you want to add anything? And also give a quick intro.
I think I know most of the people on this call, but just very briefly, I'm based in Sedalia or Castle Rock, just outside of Denver, and our specialty is really around public-private partnerships for conservation, and usually we like to play on the for-profit side, but we also have a non-profit that allows us to really create philanthropic initiatives with some of the companies that we work with. Initially, we were really focused on nature conservation. I started my career in the national parks in Africa, so that was, you know, kind of the bias. But wildfires over the past 5 years have really taken over our portfolio for some very good reasons, from both the private sector, but also through a partnership agreement with the U.S. Forest Service. And so, how we see working with the private sector, you've got the obvious one. I think the easiest way to think about it, and that's where it's going to require a change of mindset, is that for us, wildfire mitigation is more akin to a model that's a utility model, rather than a state park or a national park or any type of conservation project, because of the scale of what's needed and how the benefits are, you know, dispersed. So you're right that private sector is interested in working on, you know, investment in, you know, chainsaws and contractors, that's the first level. New technologies is something that is needed. So in that context, this year part of our partnership will include exploring how to create an incubator for biomass-based businesses in Colorado, and that has two sides of it. One will be, how do you increase the capacity of local contractors to do the work, but also what are we going to do with all that biomass? And is there a way to turn it into something useful rather than just burning it or not burning it, because we can't burn it anymore in the forest? So that's one pool, and that pool is really, if you're structuring the incentives well, or the deals well, people see, sadly, that wildfires are not going away, that it's a global issue, and so capital is interested in investing in those solutions because they see the returns in the future. Where it's less clear what the case to be made is really around the project-based financing. Why would someone pay to go beyond the defensible space? Even that, sometimes we have difficulty, just like with homeowners, convincing people that it'd be a great idea to create a defensible space around a multi-billion-dollar facility that small, very small cost for the protection. But then when it comes to really bigger scale projects outside of the utilities, I don't think that we've seen anybody cut, a 7-figure check for wildfire mitigation. And the reality is, there is not a compelling investment thesis that has been put together for any of those companies to go beyond the philanthropic aspects. So here we're pursuing two different avenues. One is working with the Zegna family in Aspen, and Zegna, if you know, it's a very famous brand of very, very high-end suits out of Milan, and they wanted to export a model that they've developed in Italy to a model of around forest health to the US. And so that's where we picked Aspen, because that's where a lot of their clients are, and they can communicate to those families. So the idea is, like, how do you improve philanthropy around forest health? Because a bunch of those families are asking, well, what can we do? We don't really know. We're giving millions of dollars to the Nature Conservancy, but what is that really doing? So we just launched last month the Oasis Zegna Global Initiatives, which is a way to kind of activate those families and family-owned businesses. But that's, even if that's exciting, they're cutting big checks, but in the ocean of what we need, it still feels like a drop, to be really honest. But they have political power, which I think was what is really important with the private sector, is how to elevate the conversation in DC and in Denver from forest, like for wildfire mitigation would be nice to have, to know it is a priority. It's a national security issue. It is like a major economic issue. It's not, we're way past the fact that it's just a conservationist issue. It is a massive issue for the government. The other one is really working on what is the business case really for those companies to invest, and that's where work is critical to bring them to the table. But it's, we have some pilots that we've launched with the U.S. Forest Service in the Pike St. Isabel National Forest in the Arapel Roosevelt, trying to use a bit of a startup approach where you put together a minimum viable product, you shop it around, you get feedback, and you try to understand what the customer is willing to pay and what is attractive. But for now, there's not really a compelling narrative that will tell us that those companies are willing to pay millions or tens of millions of dollars each to get the job done. So that's where same as with those families. I think that the strategy is a little bit different. Is where those dollars show commitment, but at the end of the day, what we want is their voice in Denver and in DC for them to say, no, I mean, if there is a massive fire, we're going to lose our workforce. Colorado's going down, the entire country is going down. So it is a priority. And it's not just, again, a bunch of CEOs of TNC and other organizations, but it's Lockheed Martin, it's, Google, it's the big companies that are saying, no, it is an economic emergency. And so that's, their dollars, I don't think on an aggregated basis would be enough to really put a dent in the issue we're looking at, but their combined power in terms of lobbying and credibility is unmatched. And that's really the game, is to bring them into the coalition for that political power. Sorry, I've been monopolizing the mic for 15 minutes.
I do want to just, that was great, Ben. I want to clarify. Ben was referring a lot to what Conservation Investment Management does, so what he does, but it's part of why he's a key leader in work, because he thinks about all these strategies. And so, but I just wanted to be clear, work isn't doing the Zinnia, efforts. That's Ben's effort that we're trying to leverage as an example into what would be additional private sector strategies.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining, Ben. Super interesting. And, it looks like we could use more and more time with you all. So I appreciate it. And sounds like, Julie, you'll present on Friday to the Leveraging Resources. I mean, that's us, the Legislative Committee. So I assume folks could jump on to that if they wanted to join that discussion too. But, one of the things, Ben, that we were talking about is, how can this committee be a support or maybe a reciprocal relationship with the efforts of work. And I think, your interaction with the private sector is a window that this committee doesn't always have, but yet we could, they're a critical piece to the overall puzzle. And so maybe this group can help a little bit more with some of the public sector recommendations or engagement and really learn from each other. So I think that was a great summary. But maybe if anyone has a last question, and then Julie would love your thoughts on just how we could continue to engage with you.
I don't see other questions. Also, for me, Allison is a key connection point on this because she's, so involved with both groups. With the legislative committee, that one's a little more obvious to me because and then the council as a whole has that power to make these recommendations annually to the state. And I think that what would be really helpful in that connection is, having works own scoping and efforts and the strategies, like the scoping document that I mentioned, any way that can help inform the dialogue and the recommendations. And if there's opportunity to iteratively say, hey, the council's thinking about these recommendations. Can we get some feedback from work? I think we can organize that and get additional feedback. And then I think also once those recommendations are made, can work, including folks unlike myself who have the ability to advocate and lobby, I do not. But can they get behind that and champion the need, which ties back to what Ben was saying about that power that some folks can bring to actually helping with policy. I think on the Leveraging Resources Committee, and we're going to run out of time today, but understanding a little bit more, just what your end goals are, what are you trying to do or deliver on would be really helpful, because I think the framing of issues, we have a lot of alignment on, as we've kind of covered, and then there's all these strategies. And I think that you're right, Amy, to the extent that some of these strategies are really going to be not led by Forest Health Council, but need other actors to come and support them. That's where I think, we could reverse. It's a two-way flow, but the opposite direction of if you all have things you're wow, it would be great to see folks mobilize on this, and this council can't do that by nature of its own origin story and its rules and all that. I think that would be helpful to bring those ideas outward and those needs outward so that groups like work can then help strategize. And again, Ben, you weren't here, but like I mentioned how that early stage capacity and planning that they've identified as pinch points are things that folks like maybe Colorado Forum might say like, yeah, we'd love to support some communities on this. So kind of just having that aligned vision of what the need and ask is could then perhaps garner even more support from a place like the forum to say, wow, everybody's saying this is needed. Great. How can we mobilize? So, but I think just as you get more clear on like what you think some of the asks are and through these back and forth conversations, maybe there's a way to bring those forward. And then again, as each of you as individual members, you have your own views into what you can learn and bring, and you're welcome to come to our work meetings too.
Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, and again, just really appreciate you coming. I learned a lot today, and I would like to be on your list to hear more. But I was thinking about the forest resilience planning guide that this committee has put together. One real goal was to identify needs and opportunities for different resource allocators, is how we reference sort of people to invest in these different things. But it leaves it up to local groups to identify what their particular pain points are, as you've been talking about. So we identified these are the pain points at each stage of the process, but then each group has their different capacities that are unique, right? And so maybe something that can bring it together is, right, somehow we need some kind of more knowledge of what those more common pain points are across all the groups. We've made a lot of assumptions about that.
Mhm.
But I think we have a framework. The Forest Resilience Planning Guide could be a really good framework, because the other thing you said of if the private sector doesn't have the incentive, they need the strategy and the confidence that people are going to be able to carry out. That's what the Forest Resilience Planning Guide is like, here's a strategy from A to Z on how to not have random acts and how to be strategic and achieve that. Now, how do we connect those needs that have been identified with funding sources is sort of where this committee really wants to go. So I think you're really speaking to a lot of we've talked about as well, and that could be a resource to accomplish a couple things that you've talked about too.
Yeah. You know, one immediate, I know we're at time, but one immediate step, and Ben and I can follow up on is this August 25th meeting, there'll be one of the group sessions that is focused on like private public funding, in particular private sector funding strategies, like a whole range, kind of like Ben was speaking to. But I wonder if we can have one sub item on that agenda of like, how do we use the frameworks you've developed and that you just mentioned, Brett, to think about, you know, the opportunities for the private sector to plug in? And can we draw a more explicit line in our conversations next week around that to say, you know, what are the private sector strategies that could help support this pain point around capacity or planning, and, you know, and just get a little more concrete on some of in lining up those frameworks.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, Julie, to hear some of the report out and discussion from that. Well, we're 1 minute over. Thank you, Julie and Ben. This is just a fascinating conversation, and really excited to get to hear more and think about ways that this group individually can potentially plug in and potentially plug in as a whole committee as well. And it's great to know, Allison, you can be a good conduit between the Forest Health Council, the committees, and work. So that's fantastic. And Julie, if you're able to send just the slides and the scoping report either to me or Allison or Courtney, we can make sure everybody has it and can learn more and follow up with you on any thoughts or questions.
Yes, I'll do that for sure. And I will just, for those who wouldn't have already gotten it, so like Amy and Brett, I'll make sure you have the information for the 25th, and just, we can add you just a list. And again, we're still just really getting organized. So love your thoughts in the future.
That would be great. I'd love to get added.
Cool. Awesome.
Well, Courtney, do we need a motion to adjourn? So moved. Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next month. All right. Bye, everyone.